Alright, so the last presentation of the class will be about the new century, and really the 21st century has been defined by 9/11. The whole world, not just the United States. With the end of the Cold War, most Americans felt more secure than ever, and when 9/11 happens, that was all for naught, and national security really comes to the forefront of everybody's mind. And so we're going to talk about the war on terrorism, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. This was to improve security at home, and it really imposed some severe limits to a lot of civil liberties of those suspected of terrorist links. A lot of people began to ask, should the United States be a republic or an empire? We'll talk a little bit about that. And the main question is, we'll get into is what people are still getting into is what's the proper balance between security and liberty and freedom, and who deserves this full enjoyment of what we consider of American freedom. Okay, so before 9/11, a little bit about George Bush. He had enacted the largest tax cut in U.S. history to stimulate growth. Most of this was towards the wealthy so that they would invest in productive activities, very much like Reagan. This is very Reaganomics, right? Trickle-down economy type of idea. In foreign affairs, before 9/11, his most controversial act was to get out of the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, which was about global warming, saying that trying to go too green would hurt American companies too much, especially American industry. But then he wasn't president long before 9/11 happened, and this is when this outpouring of patriotism and really the U.S. government benefited from this, and his popularity soared. In America, usually during wartime, a president's popularity will soar at the beginning. The only non time this happened was the Vietnam War. But in American history, usually going to war means popularity for the president at first. And like many before him, he made freedom a rallying point. And his whole answer as to why 9/11 happened was because it was us, democracies, Western democracies that love freedom, and those that hate freedom and try to take it away. Uh, Quickly after 9/11, he announces his new foreign policy in the same speech that he talks about this, and this is where he really launches his war on terrorism, which is vague. It's vaguely defined. Which makes it a lot easier for them to say who is and who is not a terrorist. When you don't really define who one is, it's quite easy to say who is and who isn't. But he also recognized there was no middle ground. In this speech, he said either you are with us or you are with the terrorist. A very Cold War type of idea. You're with us or you're against us. He Soon after 9/11, the United States knew that the Taliban was holding bin Laden in Afghanistan. Bush asked them to give him to us. They say no, so he teams up with the Northern Alliance, which is a bunch of tribes and clans in North Afghanistan who had already been fighting the Taliban, and he launches an attack. Uh, and really, this is done quite quickly. It was a good show of the force that America can draw up quickly and efficiently. The war in Afghanistan was uh, kind of an interesting thing, and it worked right away. I mean, America was in Afghanistan for a long time, but from the beginning, it showed that things were going in the right directions. At the same time, Afghanistan has never been dominated by a foreign country in the history of the world, so the United States and the Northern Alliance also had that to contend with. A little later, he starts talking about the axis of evil, and the axis of evil were the three countries: North Korea, Iran, and Iraq. The United States begins establishing military bases in places like Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. They go to the Philippines to help with an Islamic insurgency there. They solidify relations with Pakistan and Indonesia, and they accuse Iraq, Iran, and North Korea of harboring terrorists and developing WMDs, which are weapons of mass destruction. And this is why he calls them the axis of evil. By the way, Pakistan and Indonesia are not typical, what you would consider typical allies of a democratic nation, because neither are that democratic, and they have a history of dealing with citizens poorly. But anyways, when you're it's kind of the whole idea of the enemy of your enemy is your friend. Okay, and we still give large amounts of money to Pakistan, even though Osama bin Laden was found there, and it's fairly certain that the Pakistani government hid him from us for a period of time. At least their intelligence agency did. Um, and also with this axis of evil, a lot of people start beginning to question what America was doing. Right after 9/11, obviously, there was a huge outpouring for America, and everybody was on the side of this. Most people from the Western world were on the side of America, trying to hunt down terrorists. But by the end of 2002, things had begun to change. Especially with the Iraq War and the idea that weapons of mass destruction were not found, and many begin to question why America was in the Middle East, and a lot of this had to do with Israel, right? Israel in the Middle East, America's #1 ally is Israel, and as we can see today, that's very contentious because Israel is kind of this spot in the middle of Middle East that has no real relation. So a lot of people start saying, well, what is America really doing in the Middle East? And by the way, in 2002, the United States, for a long time, this isn't just George Bush, this is even before George Bush came into power, we backed dictators such as Mubarak, people who will be overthrown in the Arab Spring. These men were our allies because they kept the peace in the Middle East, these dictators, and so a lot, and other autocrats. And really, a lot of people begin to believe that the U.S. was just trying to establish an empire in the Middle East for geopolitics, but also for oil. And a lot of this had to do with Saddam Hussein. Because even though he was not a terrorist, he was a very bad person to a lot of people. He was a very big enemy of George Bush's father, and a lot of people started to say, well, he's just trying to finish the war that his father started. The one thing that is interesting about Saddam Hussein is, even though he was an autocrat, he really kept Iraq and Iran and the whole region together. He kept it peaceful, even though he was a dictator and he was brutal and he killed a lot of people, and he was a minority leading a whole country. And so a lot of people in the Western world realized this before a lot of people in America did. Even though it was a good day when Saddam Hussein was finally caught and executed, what happened afterwards was pure chaos, like we know. So there was that as well. And even though he had misgivings at the beginning, Colin Powell goes up into the United Nations in front of Congress and all of these people, and he says, our intelligence committee says that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, whether they be chemical or nuclear, and that he was also trying to seek to get uranium from Africa. And so basically, almost unanimously, the United States decides to go to war in Iraq, and this is when people begin to have misgivings about what America was actually doing in the Middle East. Okay, so we won't go through too many of the numbers of the Iraq War. I know a lot of you know a lot about it. You can do your PowerPoint on it if you want, but we'll just go through a few different things. Like we talked about last side, by 2002, this really divides the Western Alliance. Basically, what happens after 2002 is it's kind of the United States and America and Britain, excuse me, and the United Kingdom, and Australia, who are the only three real big presence in Iraq. A lot of people are still in Afghanistan because a lot of people still felt that was the right war, but the Iraq War was a little different. By February 2003, across the globe, there were 10 to 15 million people protesting it almost on a daily basis in all types of countries. And a lot of people argue this is directing attention away from our real foe, which is still the United States' probably biggest foe, maybe besides ISIL today, and that was Al Qaeda, right? Al Qaeda had no real presence in Iraq at that time. They argued that the U.S. couldn't unilaterally make the Middle East a bastion of democracy, right? This is kind of something that the United States had done since since the early 20th century, is kind of go out and say we need to spread democracy. There are a lot of places on the planet where democracy just won't work, and the Middle East may be one of them, may or may not be. And even though in 2006 Saddam Hussein was caught and put on trial and executed, and it was kind of a bump in popularity for a little bit, the end of 2006, for the Iraq War. Once he was finally executed, as we know, all mayhem broke out. And this is when people started kind of comparing it to the Vietnam War, right? Because soon after the fall of Baghdad, President Bush, in his infamous speech on the aircraft carrier, says, "Mission accomplished." But things went wrong quite quickly as looting and chaos followed, and there was sectarian violence between the Sunnis and the Shiites. The Shiites are the majority, but Hussein was a Sunni Muslim. And so what you had in Iraq was a small minority leading against the majority. And what this did was once the Sunnis were overthrown, then all chaos kind of ensued. And by the end of 2006, there were 3,000 U.S. deaths. I think it's up to 4,500 now. 20,000 wounded, hundreds of thousands of civilians were dead, hundreds of thousands more were fleeing, and many figure that by today's standards, the war has cost the United States close to $3 trillion, which is just an inordinate amount of money. And because there was no end in sight, this is kind of what how the Vietnam War worked, right? It was kind of a civil war. Well, not kind of. It was a civil war, and it was sometimes low intensity, sometimes high intensity, and a lot of the citizens of the United States began to question why the United States was in the Vietnam War, and this is kind of the Iraq War. You're seeing people die on TV, and you're saying and a lot of people are saying, why is this happening? And they're looking at the cost of war, and this was a real sense of urgency in America. And you guys all lived it, so you know how it went. I'm not saying whether it was right or wrong. I'm just saying how people compared it to the Vietnam War. And much like Vietnam, policies were made by people who may or may not have been experts in the areas we were invading. And there was kind of a distrust between key advisors of the area and the general staff for George Bush, not just George Bush himself, but other people around him who really believed that quick victory and political success would come, whereas the people who perhaps were more in tune with what the Middle East was about said, no, this is not going to happen. And it was very much the kind of attitude that JFK and LBJ had for the Vietnam War, when in actuality it was a long, costly war for the United States. And this is kind of when the United States in the world view takes a bit of a hit. The United States before the Iraq War had never really acted unilaterally outside of the Western Hemisphere, and they had never occupied a state in the Middle East like they did during the Iraq War. And so this is something that the world was not used to, and it did not look fondly on Americans. I lived in Germany for the summer of 2003, and I lived on the French-German border, and discussion after discussion with all of them saying how disappointed and what's the United States doing, and well, George Bush isn't a good person, this and that. I don't agree or disagree with that, but this is really when the United States takes a big hit on the worldview. And so the interesting thing is, though, in 2006, because Saddam Hussein was killed, George Bush still had a fairly high popularity, and most still believe that Saddam Hussein had something to do with terrorism and the act of 9/11. And so, even after 2006, in the United States, the U.S. government still was looked upon as doing the right thing. And this is kind of a U.S. type of thing, anyways, because America and North America, especially from much of the other parts of the Western world, there's still the Pacific Ocean between us. So, or excuse me, the Atlantic Ocean between us. So, it's not necessarily the United States, especially its citizenry, doesn't necessarily look upon what Europe does as important to our scheme of things. Which, a lot of people in America look at our interests first, and most nations do the same thing. So 2006, the worldview of the U.S. may not have been that great, but we, in general, as a people, still felt we were doing the right thing. Okay, so meanwhile at home, the balance between liberty and security really takes a hit, so to speak, in the sense that Congress rushed the Patriot Act through, which was a huge bill, more than 300 pages. It's likely that most of them didn't read it. They probably had their interns read it, etc. And what it really does is it gave the government power of wiretapping, spying on citizens, opening letters, reading emails, and obtaining information from third parties such as libraries, universities, etc., without the knowledge of the suspect, as long as the suspect was deemed a threat to national security. The outcome right after it's passed is nearly 5,000 foreigners in America are rounded up, 1,200 were arrested, and over 700 were detained and sent to Guantanamo Bay. Um, at the same time, the United States also could hold secret military tribunals where the right to choose a lawyer and see all the evidence would not apply since they were combatants. It's still controversial today. They talk about the NSA and the FBI, cell phones, etc., etc. So this is because of 9/11. This is what the Patriot Act was passed, and this really brings in the whole torture controversy. Many in the administration felt that the United States at this time, because of what happened, were not bound by international laws, and they did not abide by the Geneva Convention regulating the treatment of prisoners. But what the United States said is this didn't apply to Al Qaeda because they were actual combatants. They weren't a regular army, so in that sense, they weren't subject to Geneva Convention codes, because not only did they not follow the Geneva Convention codes, but they shouldn't be held. The United States shouldn't be held to doing the same thing against them. The CIA begins to set up rendition camps in Egypt, Syria, Yemen, all of these places where all of these dictators were overthrown. We set these places up with their okay, and in most Eastern European countries as well. But then you also get things like the Abu Ghraib incident, where they showed how poorly some of the POWs were treated there, and a lot of credibility for the United States goes out the window. And in late 2008, documents released showed that Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, and others were aware of it and sanctioned torture. Guantanamo Bay is still something that happens today, and we'll talk a little bit about President Obama and Guantanamo. Meanwhile, at home, to get away from the war, the recession that the United States is still somewhat in begins at the end of 2001. For instance, the computer industry slashed 40% of its jobs. But by the years 2001 and 2002, 90% of the jobs that were lost in America were in manufacturing, as many plants were closing down and going abroad to China, India, and Mexico. For example, Maytag, the dishwasher, washing machine type of company had been in Galesburg, Illinois for almost a century and closed up and went to Mexico, where workers earned less than 1/7 of the average of the $15 per hour that the average person made working for Maytag in the United States. After 2001, 2002, what the Feds do in 2003 is they lower the interest rates, and President Bush gives a $320 billion tax reduction, once again based on supply side economics. And this wasn't just to the wealthy, this was to everybody. He basically said, well, the more money that Americans have, hopefully they will spend it, and that's what will get the economy going. At the same time, in 2004, he goes up for his second term, and really, it wasn't that close of an election. John Kerry seemed inept, and also in United States history, no president had ever lost re-election during war. So even in 2006, President Bush's popularity was 2004. President Bush's popularity was quite high still. His speech said that the survival of freedom means that we need it to happen in other places as well, and so he doesn't, him and his people, they don't get out of the rhetoric that in order for the Middle East to be peaceful and in order for the world to be peaceful, what we need is we need democracy to spread around the world, and that was kind of his whole idea of the speech. Also, during at the beginning of his second term, one of the worst catastrophes in U.S. natural disasters in the history of the United States hit Louisiana, and this was in August 2005, and it was Hurricane Katrina. As you can see from this slide, this was the shot of Hurricane Katrina from space. You can see how enormous it was. Most of what was damaged was below sea level, especially New Orleans, and a lot of people had predicted that at some point the levees were going to break, and at some point this was going to happen. They just didn't know when. It just happened to be August 2005. And it quickly showed not only the ineptitude of local government, but also the federal government. It kind of showed that not only the state of Louisiana, but the United States was not ready for something like this. And even the New Orleans mayor feared evacuation would cause too much panic, and so everybody was really slow in reacting to it. And this is also when FEMA, which was led by Michael Brown under the Department of Homeland Security, showed how inept it was at preparation, and Katrina shattered the idea that the George Bush administration reacted well to disaster. After 9/11, a lot of people argued that him and his administration reacted really well. The war in Afghanistan was set up quickly, efficiently. They got bases in all of the stands that are around Afghanistan with approval from the governments. And people, not everybody, but a lot of people argued that their reaction to 9/11 was quite good, considering nobody knew it was going to happen. But this reaction was a total disaster. For many days, people remained abandoned. There were unfortunate things like bodies floating in the streets, people dying in nursing homes and hospitals, and all of this obviously was shown on TV. And New Orleans is still gripping with what happened 9 years later. By the time aid had arrived, the damage was 80, 90, $100 billion. The death toll was 1,500 people, and 2/3 of New Orleans had been displaced. And really, George Bush got also a bad reputation because he said that FEMA was doing a good job when in reality they were not. Now, I don't know how many government officials or government agencies, no matter who the president was at this time, would have reacted accordingly. This was the largest disaster by far in American history, so I'm not saying they did a good job. It's just, nowadays I'm sure things are much better, but they learned from this disaster. Uh, but also, at the same time, Katrina did show many individual efforts by people to save with boats, people in rooftops, attics. They showed the private donations. Um, and even though the damage was catastrophic and they're still dealing with it, there were a few good spots around New Orleans, and it really showed how Americans banded together, in a sense. To continue with the home front, a lot of things that the U.S. government is dealing with today are also occurred during this time. At the end of 2005, it was estimated that 11 million undocumented peoples entered the United States, and 7 million of which began to work there in the country. Depending on who you ask, economists still do not agree on the impact of immigration today. It is clear that, unfortunately, it is clear that many of the of people coming into the country have a low education level, and they're low-skilled workers, and they do push down the wages at the bottom of the economic ladder, which unfortunately means African Americans are affected the most by immigration and people coming into the country. And many in the discussion filled the jobs that most people think are underneath them, that many people born in America don't want to do today, such as construction, domestic workers, cleaning houses, things like that, and agricultural workers picking strawberries, onions, things like that. If any of you have been around farming communities, you know, those are jobs that you used to do when you were in high school, but now other people are doing that. Fearing that it was getting out of control in 2006, the House made it a felony to be in the United States illegally. But this begins demonstrations throughout the country, and many argued that freedom was the whole idea of freedom was the chance to try and get the American dream, right? It's the basic argument that you hear all the time is everybody from America was an immigrant at some point in time, right? It's a nation of immigrants, and really everybody should have the chance. That is the argue. A lot of people argue for the American dream. However, the House and the Senate couldn't agree on much about immigration reform, much like we're dealing with today, as a matter of fact, literally today. But the only thing that the House and the Senate could agree on was to build a 700-mile wall on the Mexican-American border. And as we know, that didn't really do anything. It didn't really help anybody. At the same time, in 2007, the housing bubble burst. And by 2008, the banking system was on the verge of collapse. Really, the roots lay in private and public speculation, spending, and get-quick-rich schemes. And for years, because of the early recession in the early 2000s, the Feds had kept interest rates low, first to help when the tech bubble burst. And so what this does, it enables more Americans to borrow money to buy houses, right? And so like this unchecked mortgages come out where people probably who shouldn't get loans got loans from the bank, and houses cost too much money, so people borrow more money, or they put it on credit cards, and eventually this will burst. The average American household by 2007 made $50,000 per year, but owned $84,000 in mortgages, meaning they were well below their worth. Right, their house was basically they couldn't afford the house that they're living in, and a lot of people just leave their houses, walk away from it. The average American by 2007 has $14,000 in student and car loans, $8,500 in credit card debt, and $10,000 in home equity loans debt. Okay, so in 2007, it would be easy to see that almost every American family, individual, whoever, had some type of debt, and this is not good. So what ends up happening is by the end of 2007, you get what people consider the Great Recession. Many owed much more than their house was worth. The banks stopped making loans, businesses dry up, and some $7 trillion in shareholder wealth went down the tubes. And places like the Lehman Brothers that we've heard of, they lost $2.3 billion in a couple of days and they go bankrupt. This is when you get the whole government intervention, too big to fail type of banks. Sally Mae, people who have student loan thing, all of this, the the federal bailout of GM, and the whole argument of what does the American government really need to do to make sure that businesses keep running. And that was the whole debate, is whether the government should bail big companies out, or whether they should just let them go under because they practice poor ethics and business sense. But what ends up happening in a general sense is that many banks begin to close and people stop spending money. And when people stop spending money, then more people start losing jobs. And in 2007, 2008, 2.5 million jobs were lost on the American home front. And for the first time in history, there were more women in the workforce than there were men. And a lot of this has to do with manufacturing jobs that are leaving the country, as well as banking jobs and computer tech jobs as well. So you put all of these things together, and the Republican Party really had very little chance of winning re-election. Also, Hillary was actually the favorite, but the nomination actually goes to Barack Obama because not only was he a very good politician, but he's very eloquent. He's a very good speaker, and he's a very good campaigner. And it also kind of showed how American politics had changed. He was one of the few senators, he was a very little-known senator, by the way, who voted no against the Iraq War. And people wanted change. That's his whole campaign was change, not experience. He went against John McCain, who was the oldest man to ever run for president, age 72. And his very, very large mistake was actually having Sarah Palin as his vice president. She showed her ineptness in domestic and foreign affairs, and I think that this is Politico people talking, not me. The general sense. If you're a Sarah Palin fan, don't take offense. She really hindered John McCain and his age. Not to mention the idea of another Republican president just didn't sit well with people in the United States, and Barack Obama won 53% of the popular vote in a huge electoral college gap. Got many places that had been strongly Republican for decades, places like Indiana. And with things like Republicans calling for lower taxes, Bush's approval rating at the end of his tenure was 22%. There was an economic recession, etc., and President Obama looked new and fresh to the young, especially young African Americans, people in the South who usually vote Republican, Latinos or Hispanics, and suburbanites. He really felt like a lot of people felt like he was looking out for them. And then there's also questions about how critical this election really was, besides the fact that he was the first African American, obviously, to ever be elected president. But critical elections, it remains to be seen. A critical election is something like in 1812 when Thomas Jefferson ended the Federalist Party when he became elected, or Lincoln's election that ended slavery and began the Civil War, or even, you could even say, maybe even Ronald Reagan's election that ended deregulation, the lowering of federal government control, and an aggressive foreign policy that ended the Cold War. And the reason why Reagan's election may have been critical is because both Bush and Clinton as well kind of followed many of the same tenets that President Reagan followed, a real aggressive foreign policy, free trade type of ideal. Okay, so that was also a critical election. And this will remain to be seen until after he is done and people can look back and see what kind of things that Barack Obama did. Um, yeah, but when he was elected, 1 million people came to Washington to view his election. He pledged diplomacy and foreign affairs to protect the environment, to combat inequality. He promised an overwhelming change in healthcare, and he blamed the culture of greed and irresponsibility for the woes of America today. Basically, he said Wall Street needs to get under control. Um, and he really, really says that the United States needs to start putting the common good before individualism. Okay? And his first 3 months, much like FDR's first 100 days, went as follows. He said he was going to close Guantanamo Bay. He has not. He said he was going to bar the use of torture, which obviously, if Guantanamo Bay is open, then torture still happens. He tried to help implement more women's rights to their bodies. He really abandoned the rhetoric about God-given right for America to spread democracy. That was a big change. And I'm sure all of you noticed that people around the world celebrated when Barack Obama was elected because he really said we're going to change how we deal with people around the world. Um, he gets the first Hispanic woman ever on the Supreme Court, Sonia Sotomayor. He also gets Yelena Kagan voted on the next year. He pushed through Congress the $800 billion stimulus package and new government spending for construction, unemployment, and aid to states to balance the budget. Okay, this was the largest single spending by the U.S. government in American history, even more than FDR did during the New Deal. He began his campaign in 2010 for changing health care, which we call Obamacare today, which is a reality now. This is something that President Nixon, President Reagan, President Clinton, they have all tried to do, and President Obama has actually done it. Um, and basically the whole it's very complicated, but the bottom line is he said every American needs to have insurance, so you either buy insurance or be fined, and most businesses need to provide it to their employers, and it was really the single most far-reaching domestic legislation since the 1960s. This was a huge deal, and we're kind of still seeing the workings of it today. But at the same time, the BP oil spill happened, which was all about unregulated refineries. In the Congress and the Senate, partisanship that the United States had not seen for decades and decades begins to occur. He couldn't get anything passed, really. Immigration reform stalled. And with that, hostilities raised towards the whole idea, as people are in a recession and people are losing jobs, people began blaming immigrants for their woes. This is just something that has happened time immemorial since the beginning of the United States, and during Barack Obama's first couple of years in office, this is a really big issue that is still being dealt with today. And out of all of this, you get what we call the Tea Party. If any of you have watched Newsweek or are looking for something to watch Newsweek. It deals a lot with this. It's an HBO show. It's very interesting, and it's smart, and it's quick, and it kind of gives a good background of all of this and what the Tea Party stands for. But really what happens after President Obama is elected is there's a Republican revival that brought up this ideal that freedom is really the absence of the government in individual affairs. And they're not just against Barack Obama or Democrats, but really they're even against Republicans who voted for bailouts or the stimulus bill, or any type of Republican who voted for any type of government intervention into private life. And the whole it's kind of Ron Paulish libertarianism, but even more far right, and this really took over the Republican Party, and it just created even more partisanship than the United States had seen in a long time. And what I think what President found is that it was like all presidents before him. It's easy to say this is what I'm going to do and criticize from the outside, but then when you get into the actual presidency, there's a realization that the president doesn't have as much power as people really think he does. And really nothing was getting passed because of this huge partisanship in the Senate and the Congress. But he did promise no more military tribunals. They still exist. He planned to withdraw from Iraq. This is early in his presidency, but he sent 17,000 more to Afghanistan, and in December 2009, he sent 30,000 more. So even though he promised to end the war in Iraq, he sent more troops to Afghanistan, which a lot of people agreed with because a lot of people argued this is where the war on terror really starts anyways. Iraq was kind of a different, although as we know today, President Obama did finally end the Iraq war, even though now we see what has occurred because of no more U.S. influence in the region. But he said he was going to do it, and he did. He also basically ended the Afghanistan war as well, even though the U.S. still has some troops there, and it's still going on. It's more of a low-intensity war. And really, he came into power, or he was elected president as the recession was going up. Um, his advisors were still from Wall Street. Lots of the economic people that he listened to were from Wall Street. And he kept up the whole idea of the George Bush administration's idea of pouring federal money into the banks so they did not fail. At the same time, by the end of 2009, unemployment reached 10.2%, which is just drastically high. And many of the 8 million jobs that were lost in the recession total were still gone by 2008, 2009, 2010. As we know, things have begun to turn around a bit. Not everybody is seeing this, but the unemployment level has gone down from 10.2%, which, that it can't go much farther up than that. So that's a plus. But overall, what President Obama wanted to do was change immigration reform, get rid of Guantanamo Bay, and kind of get people working in the United States and have better quality, have America viewed better on the world scene than they had before he got into power. It is basically up to you to decide whether he has done what he said he was going to do or not. But that is something that we will see in 2 or 3 years down the road. He still has 2 years left as his presidency. So that will be it, and that's our last PowerPoint. I hope you enjoyed the class, and if you have any questions about the book reviews or your final PowerPoint, just let me know, and have a good break.